Levi Brackman here with Truths, Jewish Wisdom for Today. Thank you so much for joining. Before I start, I just want to ask, if you enjoy this podcast, please either leave a review, subscribe on wherever you listen to the podcast, whether it's on YouTube or Spotify or anywhere else, Apple Podcasts. Subscribe, leave a review, or send me an email. Let me know how we are doing here on the podcast. Give me some feedback. I'd love to hear from you. Now, on to the conversation for this podcast. I'm really excited that I had my friend, Professor Don Seeman, on the podcast. I've known Don for well over a decade. We have spent time together, not only in the United States, but also in Israel. He's a really wonderful guy, a true scholar, and a really deep thinker. Don is an anthropologist with a PhD from Harvard University, and he also holds a joint appointment in religion and at the Tam Institute for Jewish Studies at Emory University. He is an expert on Maimonides and Hasidism. He's also an expert on Ethiopian Jewry. He has written extensively about Rav Kook, and I'm honored and excited that he came on the podcast, had a conversation, and shared his knowledge and insight with us. As always, I started off asking Don, like I ask all my guests, to describe himself in his own terms. And you'll see, especially with Don, that was a good jumping off point because he described himself as an Orthodox Jew, and which he is. And we got into a deep conversation about what defines Orthodox Judaism, both from a personal level and also from an institutional, global level, and where it came from. Fascinating conversation. That wasn't the planned conversation for the podcast, actually. We decided initially to talk about pluralism within the different paths one can take to religion or spiritual paths. We discussed that as well towards the end, but we really got into a very interesting conversation about what defines Orthodox Judaism today. So with no further ado, I present to you my conversation with Don Seeman.
I suppose describing in my own terms is an unfair question because Dam karov el atzmo. We all have certain illusions about ourselves, and stating them in public is just an invitation to be fact-checked and contradicted. So I don't know about that. I will say that in my own terms, I'm someone who has had difficulty over the years describing myself in very particular ways. In North America, for instance, the Jewish community is very balkanized into different communities. There's, of course, secular Jews, but there's Reform and Conservative and Reconstructionist. And those are all fairly well defined with some leeway. And then there's Orthodoxy, which is a huge jigsaw puzzle. And people don't recognize sometimes that I think Orthodoxy is an incredibly diverse, vibrant, uncentered movement, whether it's even fair to call it a movement. Right? Torah, which has 70 faces, according to the classical rabbis. And the 70 was not a number that they counted. It just means a lot. There are a lot of different ways of approaching Torah. And I, as an individual, have always been somebody who was attracted to multiple facets of Torah and attracted to multiple different kinds of teachers or role models in Torah. And because I didn't grow up in a very clear tradition, I didn't grow up as a Chabad Chassid or Torah Misara or something like that. So I've come to these teachings in my own way, and I've struggled since I was young to make something coherent out of it. And one of the reasons that I fell in love with Rav Kook, there are so many reasons to fall in love with Rav Kook, but one of the reasons I fell in love with Rav Kook is because he seems to give permission to this kind of reaching here and there and struggling to bring things together, not to make them homogeneous, but to juxtapose them one with the other, different modes of divine service, different ways of thinking about Torah, different ways of thinking about the human, what's a human being. Rav Kook says it like this in one place. He says, everybody who does any traditional Jewish learning at all knows that on any practical matter of Jewish law, of halakha, there are 35 opinions. I made up the number, but there are lots of opinions, and there are sub-opinions, and there are sub-opinions. And there are opinions that were accepted more broadly, and there are opinions that were not accepted very well. Some remain kind of minor traditions, leitmotif within the Jewish community. Some you never hear about again after a certain point. It's very complex. Mm-hmm. And that's why not only can you not just pick up the Torah, the Bible, and think, okay, now I will know how to be Jewish. You can't even really do that with the Mishnah or the Talmud, because it's been 1,500, 2,000 years since then, and readings of the Talmud have diverged to a tremendous amount. The Meiri and the Ramban and the Rambam and Rashi and the Balei Tosafot are different worlds. And everybody understands that is true within halacha. Mm-hmm. And although there are certain people who in their learning try to moderate any perception of a disagreement or gap between different opinions, at some point everybody recognizes the Rambam and the Balei Tosafot don't agree about all sorts of matters when Shabbat starts, right? All sorts of things. And yet we live with that comfortably. And nobody says, well, you have to go to the Maimonides shul and you have to go to the Balei Tosafot shul. And within the same synagogue, there are people who are wearing Rabbeinu Tam tefillin, and there are people who are not wearing Rabbeinu Tam tefillin. And the Orthodox community, although it has a reputation for being narrow and self-righteous, actually, and sometimes is, but actually includes within itself a tremendous amount of tolerance, but celebration of difference. And some people like the difference in their synagogue. That's how my synagogue sort of functions. But some people at least know there's another synagogue across the street that they cannot go to, but they're happy that it's there because it represents a different way of grasping out at the divine will. Now,
it's so interesting, if I may interject for a second, that
you may.
What you've really said here is that there is no such thing as orthodoxy. And in many ways, orthodoxy is a modern innovation.
So let me preface that by going back to your original question. Maimonides says, you asked two questions, I'm going to answer the second one first, which is describe myself. And I will come to your question. I have a PhD in social anthropology. Mm-hmm. I teach in a department of religion and Jewish studies at Emory University, where I have a tenured position, thank God. And I'm also the rabbi of a small synagogue in Atlanta called the New Toko Shul, whose existence testifies to some of the things that we're going to talk about today. Now, when you say, how do you define yourself and what is orthodoxy? Is there such a thing as orthodoxy? I've evolved on this question in the following way. When I lived in Israel for quite a few years before coming to Atlanta, and when I arrived back in America, in Atlanta, I had a significant allergy to the term Orthodox because it is narrow and exclusionary and doesn't seem to account for the breadth and the depth of Torah that exists in this world today. And the Orthodox community that I know, which many of the listeners or viewers probably also know, devotes a lot of its time to boundary keeping, a lot of its time. If there was as much time put into reaching Nevuah as there was figuring out who's Orthodox and who's not and drawing those boundaries, we would probably be living in the time of prophetic revelation again already. On the other hand, now that I've spent some time back in America and functioning in the Jewish community here, and I've been running a synagogue, so I've come to feel that these labels actually do matter, not because they're historically representative. In other words, it's unimportant to me whether in the 1200s you would have walked into the synagogue of Rabbeinu Tam and said, are you Orthodox? Would he have known what you were talking about? Of course not. But he would have had a very strong opinion about what constitutes Torah and what constitutes not Torah, maybe even in some cases heresy or another religion or avodah zarah or simply a path in Torah that's not his. And he would have had, like anybody in Torah would have, a nuanced set of responses to each of those cases. There's somebody who holds a different opinion than me about what the tefillin look like, and I live happily with them. And there are people who worship a different God, and I can live happily with them in their own house of worship, right? And there are people that I think are actively trying to undermine the tradition that we've received, and those have to be held at arm's length. Now, I'm not talking about interpersonally. You can have friends, anybody you want, but I'm speaking about an intellectual kind of relationship. So in America, where Orthodoxy to this day is on its back foot, it's on the defensive all the time because it's a minority movement. And there's all sorts of stuff going on. Once went on a trip to northern Florida, a road trip, and I was trying to look for a synagogue. And on my map, what came up were dozens of little Messianic Jewish synagogues.
Yep.
Now, so in a world like that, so I think the term orthodoxy has some virtue in the sense that, first of all, it's accuracy in advertising. You have to tell people who you are and what is this institution and what does it stand for, even if you can't define it precisely. But most of us have a pretty good sense of what's outside of it. And of course, on the boundaries, we fight. Okay, so again, you ordain women, can you sing Hatikva, right? So we fight about the things at the edges. But the vast majority of issues that have really already been decided demarcate what is an increasingly clear distinction between orthodoxy and the rest. And so I don't think we can function without it, even though it's an intellectually problematic.
It's interesting because you straight away went to the institutional point of view of it, which is, it's like when people ask me about different policies in the United States, which one's better than the other. I'm like, I leave that to the policymakers because I don't have the correct position, A, and B, expertise to know about that.
Right.
But then there's on the individual level, right? So in other words, what goes on inside the synagogue, if the rabbi has to decide, is it Orthodox, is it not Orthodox? If you're giving a kashrut certification to a restaurant, then if the rabbi is Orthodox or not, that person's going to decide based on the halacha, which he keeps, and then different people will decide whether to trust and rely upon that. But I'm talking about on the individual level, like personally, right? I can go to an Orthodox synagogue, for example, but am I personally Orthodox? In other words, do I have to take my flag and then attach it to that mast? Do I need to do that? I think that's something which is different for the individual when you can say, I don't need to be necessarily bound by that label because I'm not sure that label is something which the Balei Tosfos or even the Rambam, or go even further back, Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses, would even appreciate or understand. In other words, there's a political reason for, I fully understand why people want to keep it that way. But then on the personal level, I don't think individuals need to necessarily walk around saying, yeah, I'm Orthodox or I'm this or I'm that, because the labels are not relevant.
But they may have relevance in the following way. When I visited town and I looked for a synagogue to put tefillin on in the morning. So I personally would probably be willing, especially when I'm traveling, to visit any Orthodox synagogue. In other words, whether I exactly practice that way or exactly agree with its ideology, there's a realm of discourse.
You want to know what you're getting, right? And then and now, that label gives you value.
That can sometimes create a false sense of unity, in the sense that even within the same synagogue, people show up to pray. It's not obvious that they're all praying in the same way or thinking about the same thing or even have the same conception of God. Okay, because although Orthodoxy today defines itself theologically on certain kinds of hot button issues that became controversial, usually in the 19th century, right?
Yes.
Will the temple be rebuilt? Okay, so that's become a hot button issue. But on the really significant things like, what does it mean to pray to God? Is there an Orthodox consensus? I don't think so. What are you accomplishing when you do a mitzvah, when you perform a commandment? Are you being mitake? Are you rectifying something in the upper worlds? Are you working on yourself? Is it an act of submission to authority? All of the above, some of the above. I don't know what the person sitting next to me in synagogue thinks about that unless I talk to them. And I think that's good. There are certain kinds of synagogues that may be defined more narrowly in terms of particular theology.
Yep.
But to get back to the quote from Rav Kook I offered earlier, everybody understands that in halakha there are different opinions which coexist, right? But people forget that the same is true in the world of Agadah, in the world of non-halachic material.
And theology.
So he includes theology within Agadah, right? Okay. Agadah is everything that's not halakha. Chassidut, theology, Jewish thought, philosophy, whatever.
You could have two people, your friend and our friend, Zev Faber was on, and he mentioned, I think also from Atlanta, right, originally? And so he mentioned that he went to yeshiva growing up, where they basically thought anyone who wasn't 100% in keeping with Maimonides' negative attribute theology was serving idols. So you can have within Orthodoxy one group of people thinking that the other group were actually idolaters.
But my guess is they ate in the kosher restaurants, even though they didn't know whether the mashgiach was an idolater or not, because that's rhetorical, right? I can say, I think you're worshiping idols, but I don't really believe it on some fundamental level, because then that would set in motion a whole different set of relationships, which nobody is
right.
Is
on
doing.
A social level, it makes no sense to do that. By an ideological level, they actually think that. So
fine.
Which is kind of the point I'm making, that individually, the act calling someone Orthodox and someone else not Orthodox is actually, on the individual level, is actually not really relevant, right? Am I going to check your tzitzis to make sure that your theology is exactly in keeping with mine? And I'm not going to. So in other words, as long as we go to the same shul, we're part of the same social circles, etc., whether I define myself as Orthodox or not is not really relevant, and it's not a term which actually holds any meaning beyond the political.
Okay, I'm not sure if I go that far. In the sense that, of course, it has relevance to all kinds of things. Are you a witness for this matter or for that matter?
But if I'm an idolater, I shouldn't be.
Of course,
even though
I don't actually believe that they think that those people are idolaters. In other words, I think that's rhetorical. I think what they actually mean is that this is a form of Judaism that I don't agree with, and that I wish I could convince everybody not to hold by. But since most of the community disagrees with me, I'm happy to live within that community anyway, in a way that I wouldn't if I actually thought they were slaughtering sacrifices to Baal and Ashtaroth. But again, this is part of why Rav Kook is important to me.
Yeah.
Because he comes into the world, he makes Aliyah in 1904 to Jaffa. He becomes the rabbi of Jaffa and the surrounding communities, which of course is the nascent Tel Aviv. Yep. He's the rabbi of the kibbutzim, right? So he has what we would today call very ultra-Orthodox constituents and completely anti-religious constituents. And as the chief rabbi, he sees himself as having to serve both of those worlds. In other words, he's not just the rabbi of the Orthodox, the firm Jews, he's the rabbi of everybody. Now, he believes deeply that what we call orthodoxy, and he had that term as well, right? That was already in the 19th century a well-established term. Orthodoxy has, in a sense, shot itself in the foot by excluding powerful sources of thought and feeling and energy, which are not in themselves counter halachic, but which it took people a while to figure out how to deal with. So even think about Hasidism, right? Nowadays, people think about people's image of an ultra-Orthodox Jew is a Chassid with long peyot and a long jacket. But people forget that in the 18th century and the 19th century, that was considered a radical breakaway movement, which was not Orthodox in that sense. And lots of Hasidim today will say, oh, we're not Orthodox. But of course they are, because when they go to the supermarket, they still look for the OK and the OU, and right, they don't only eat their own fried stuff. And they do pray in other synagogues besides their own. There is a kind of pan-Orthodoxy that matters on a day-to-day level in some way. You just can't allow it to get too much of an epistemological. As long as Orthodoxy is opposed to Hasidism, as long as it's opposed to the innerness of the Torah, what we might call the Kabbalistic tradition, as long as it's opposed to science and modernity and understanding of the world, the national rebuilding that's happening in the land of Israel, as long as it's opposed to all of those things, I'm at war with it, right? I'm at war with that exclusion. But at the end of the day, when he went home, he bought his food at the same market as the ultra-Orthodox Jew next door. He didn't eat the food from the kibbutzim, except probably the produce after he took tithes. And there are interesting stories about that. But when he visited the kibbutzim, he made tremendous impression, but it's not obvious that he ate while he was there. And there are various eyewitness testimonies about that. But Orthodoxy needs to be
Would you say it's interesting? Because I think that kind of shows in many ways that Orthodoxy is really a religion of practice, not of theology and not of ideology. right?
So
In
I'm
other
going to say the
words,
opposite. No, I'm
if
going
we
to say
all
exactly the
practice
opposite.
together, no, but what you're saying is I'll eat, although theologically, I might entirely disagree with you 100%. And my approach to Judaism might be entirely different than yours, but I'll still eat your hechsher. I'll still eat from your food and not from someone else's food, because on a practical level, I know that you've read the same practice book that I have. And therefore,
So,
that's what kind of makes us the same.
so yes, we're a very practice-focused community, but there are limits to that. So somebody who, to all outward respects, is an observant Orthodox Jew, but I know that privately they believe that Jesus Christ is the Messiah, is not an Orthodox Jew, and I wouldn't treat them as such for all sorts of purposes. Somebody who follows the rules but privately is an atheist is in a different category than that, but also there are certain ways in which they're not Orthodox, they're orthoprax. Now, I actually want to say the opposite, which is our world of practice is enormously important, but it's a lie that was propagated in the 19th century that says that Judaism doesn't have any mandatory beliefs. Of course it does. We argue about what those are, right?
Mm-hmm.
But we also argue about what makes meat kosher. And we argue about how to achieve a proper divorce. We argue about very substantial matters in halakha all the time. And we should argue more, in my opinion, not less, about matters of agadah, which includes theology, but theology is such a narrow term.
Yeah.
I want us to argue about it, because without it, I think we become a kind of passionless blob.
But again, you mentioned the point about believing in Jesus as being the Messiah, or whatever. And that's such an interesting example that you bring, because if I took the name Jesus and I took those ideas and I put it someone else's name, inserted someone else's name in there, who is accepted as Orthodox, that would be a perfectly acceptable belief.
So,
in other words, it's
I have more problems with that. I have more problems with it. And again, there are gradations. It's one thing to say, we believe that the Messiah died and he's going to come back at some point, which is represented someplace in the Talmud. It's not a mainstream position. Maimonides says that it's false, but okay, if it's in the Talmud, it's hard to argue that's a heretical position. But of course, major forms of Christianity took another step, which was the divinization of the Messiah. It's not simply, here's a person who at the time of the resurrection of the dead will be back, but this is an entity that has divine status. And I think that even if that person was wearing tefillin, I would be hard pressed to eat their shechita. Okay, now this is a real problem that the Orthodox community is facing today, for reasons we both know, and we don't yet have a good answer. But part of the reason we don't yet have a good answer is because nobody wants to talk about agadah, nobody wants to talk about theology. And the theology that we do talk about is pablum, right? So there's a sort of, everybody agreed about all these things going back through history.
But I'll push back a little bit. Maybe it's because the community as a whole doesn't, it cares much more about who's in and who's out from a political perspective than the actual theology of it. In other words,
sure.
And that therefore in practice, you can see what actually defines it by the things they really care about.
Sure, but now you're asking an anthropological question, right? So, which is fine. I'm an anthropologist. I appreciate that. You can define the boundaries of community in all different kinds of ways. One way is, and an important way is, what do other people think about that, right? Somebody who drives to synagogue and walks in late, having driven to synagogue, can they be called up to the Torah? Now, you and I know that's a subject of some debate. The mainstream minhag in America, the mainstream custom in America is that they can. And we've made peace with it, not in the sense that we think it's okay to drive to synagogue. That was the conservative movement's mistake, but that we recognize the reality that some people do, and we don't want to cast them out. But maybe there are certain things for which we do want to cast them out. And maybe it matters whether or not the fight has already been lost or the fight is still ongoing. And maybe there's a difference between people that we view as basically intentioned and people that we view as trying to take the community down from the inside. There are all sorts of gradations, but sociologically, what people will accept is one question. But now you asked, the question you asked me, I understood to be, how do I understand things? Okay, so those are not exactly the same thing. And it goes both ways. As a rabbi, there are people that congregants would probably throw out if they walked in that I wouldn't throw out. and it's their shul on some level, so they may have the right to throw them out, whether I agree or not. That's another complicated question. But there are also, it goes the other way. There may be people that they would be very comfortable with that I think should not be shliach tzibur. They should not be praying on behalf of the community, right, in a public role. And I may say it, and that may arouse controversy. By the way, I'm not talking about any particular case right now. I'm just, right?
Yeah.
So we can talk theologically and halachically, or we can talk sociologically. Those intersect. They're not completely separable, but for conversation's sake, I do want to separate them.
Yeah, I understand. But we do observe that there are certain people who took certain opinions once upon a time, and Louis Jacobs is an example of it and was thrown out. There are other people who've taken similar points of view and haven't been thrown out. There's a lot of politics, in other words, and who's in and who's out.
But politics is not a bad word. Politics is the way people talk about how to live together.
Yeah.
And that's part of Torah also. Okay, let me give you a very practical example, although this is
politics is distinct from theology, though, right? In other words, it's not, we don't have a catechism, is the point I'm making, which others do. And because of that, these things are very fluid and therefore very hard to really define, which is where on the individual level, I understand on the political level or on the institutional level, people have to make these boundaries.
But sure,
individually, it's hard to define.
But let me make the following observation, which you can disagree with. But I think matters of halacha, matters of Jewish law, are also often very hard to define. And there are also sometimes multiple standards that we could use, or that people who are alive today do use here or there in different communities, or even in the same community at different times for different purposes. All of that is true, not only of Agadah, it's true of halacha as well. What I'm objecting to is what I hear, which you may or may not intend, but what I hear, which is the idea that sort of things are open and fluid, so it doesn't matter, right? It's all about practice, and people can believe what they want. So I'm not saying that. I'm explicitly not saying that, because what I think the American Jewish community suffers from is an overabundance of underthinking, right? And that's not just the Orthodox community, that's America. Okay, maybe that's the world today.
Yeah.
We have an overabundance.
And in your article, Rav Kook actually rails against that, at least from what you describe.
Of course, because I wrote it, so he speaks in my voice. But yes, in other words, here's the thing. I think that there are a range of different ways of thinking about this. There's an approach that says, oh, Judaism doesn't have mandatory beliefs. As long as we all practice the same, that's fine. Mm-hmm. That was a myth that I think was perpetuated by people from as far back as Moses Mendelssohn, and became more and more entrenched in the Jewish community because A, we wanted to distinguish ourselves from people with catechisms. We don't have one. And B, it's easier not to think about this stuff. But I think what happens is that unless the inner dimension of Torah is part of our lives, it becomes a dry branch. And the inner life of Torah is all about these complex matters that people don't agree about. Yeah. So let me give you a very concrete example. Okay, if I walked into any Orthodox synagogue today and I stopped people randomly and I said, "Does God have a body?" Okay, what would they all say? No, they would say, "Of course not. That's heresy, right? Other religions believe that God is incarnated. We don't believe that." Okay. And they can quote to you from Maimonides where he says that's a principle of faith that cannot be abridged. However, there was a great scholar of the last generation or the generation before that who authored an encyclopedic work called Torah Shlema. He was Rabbi Menachem Kasher. He was a Ger Chassid by birth, and actually his descendants live here in my community. But he came under the influence of Rav Kook at a young age. Rav Kook is one of the people who encouraged him to write the Torah Shlema, and he became a Zionist and whatever. But the Torah Shlema is a collection of all of the midrashic sources on every verse in the Torah. And then at the end of each section of each parsha, he has certain things he decided to write an essay about. Mm-hmm. So he has an essay in the back of, I think it's Parshat Yitro, in which he says that if you look carefully at the history of Jewish thought, you find that this Maimonidean position, which is that it's utter heresy to think that God could have a body, was not the position of classical Ashkenaz. And he can quote names. And I was reflecting about this because it bothered me, because it went against what I imagined about the Jewish community. And he brings the words of somebody from among the Tosafot that you probably wouldn't remember their name because it's not an everyday name. But the opinion that he spelled out struck me as being correct to describe what the American Orthodox community is like today, which is, he said, look, Maimonides' position was that you can't say God has a body because that's a limitation placed on divine infinitude and power, and it's turning God into an object, and that's just not appropriate. But some people who lived around the same time, when they heard this coming from Sfaradim like the Rambam or his son, said, who are you to tell God what he can or can't do? In other words, there's a different way of spinning the argument, which is that saying God can't do this or God can't be that is itself a delimitation, right? And so there's this tradition, which I think still exists, which doesn't like the philosophical position articulated by Maimonides or the Gaonim before him, right? He didn't invent this. This was a tradition that was old when he came around. He just was the best spokesperson that they'd had in 500 years. But this was an old position. And in Germany, in Franco-Germany, for the most part, they weren't having it. And I think what happened today is that today everybody gives lip service to Maimonides. In other words, when you ask people, what do we believe? They can quote the 13 principles of faith.
That's the closest we have to a catechism.
But when you drill down, you often find that they're not quite clear on what it means, or they actually believe something that Maimonides would completely have rejected. So the 13 principles of faith serves a function. That's a different podcast. We can discuss what function it serves. But it's not obvious to me that everybody who quotes it, believes in them the way that Maimonides would have wanted or would have intended. But that's fine with me. In other words, I'm comfortable living in a world where the Balei Tosfot would argue with Maimonides about major theological issues. And I'm comfortable living in a world where some of those issues are no longer quite as burning because over 800 years we've taken a side, right? But the fact that there's the Balei Tosfot who believed something means that prima facie, I can't just draw that outside of the circle and say you're a heretic. Okay, so the deep knowledge of Torah, I think, has a function of making it more difficult to read people completely out of the community on these types of matters. And I'm comfortable with that too. But let's argue about it the same way
it's so interesting, because I think that, and I'm going to, I know that you'll deny, or you might deny that this is really what's going on here. But what I hear from you is that the real problem is if you have somebody who comes along and he's trying to take the community down from the inside, so to speak. In other words, this is like an enemy from within. That person has to be expelled. But if the person's just mistaken, or they have a view which actually could be accepted or could be found in other sources, Jewish sources, which maybe we've now said that's not the case. So someone comes along and says, actually, God can have a body, and it's Rabbi so-and-so, or it manifests in Rabbi so-and-so. And there are some books which say that's fine. I think there was a book which I came across, I've been looking for recently in my library, I can't find, which kind of traces that back all the way through, how God can actually manifest itself in humans and is found in ancient Jewish sources as well. There's another book, a Jewish book, I forget what it's called, written by a guy called Pevsner, who's now the Chabad rabbi in France, in Paris, who was one of my teachers, where he actually shows that this idea of God manifesting himself in a human is actually a pretty normal Jewish view. And
when
a lot of Chassidut has it.
When that book came out, I was living in Jerusalem, and
Alat Tzadikim, I think it's called.
So it may or may not be the same book we're talking about, but similar ideas. And my religious neighbors came to me because they knew I was doing some research in Chabad, and angrily held this up and said, this is Avodah Zarah. And the truth is that copies of the book, if it's the same book we're talking about, vanished. They vanished from the National Library. They were taken off the shelves in bookstores because internally Chabad became very sensitive about this. And
but it's not just Chabad; it's found in
of course. But in other words, look, Levi, you're doing a podcast, right? So I understand that part of it is to say something that draws people in. But I'm an academic, so my goal is to tamp everything down and make sure you understand that it's really dry and dull and boring. And that, so in other words, you don't have to go as far, right? Shaul Magid, who's an academic, we probably both know his works, had, not Orthodox, but he's a very well-known academic who studies Hasidism, and he has a book called, I forget the exact title, Incarnational Judaism or something like that. And it's about teachings about the manifestation of divinity within the tzaddikim in Hasidic theology. Okay, now, I'm not going to get into the details of that book right now because I don't have it in front of me and it's not fresh in my mind. And I remember when I read it that there were things I agreed with and things I didn't agree with. But I don't think that in fairness, you could translate the sources that he quoted as saying the Rebbe is God. Right? There's all sorts of gradations, right? A manifestation.
No, but I'm not talking about even, I don't even think that this is something which is unique to Chabad. In other words, this is, and it's definitely far be it from me to ever criticize this within any part of Judaism. I understand, though, that the idea that God manifests himself in a human, whatever that means, whether you say that means the person is God or not, that was not what I was bringing up. But that manifestation of God in the human physical form is not something which is antithetical to ancient Jewish teachings or even modern Jewish teachings. In other words, like that concept is still here and alive, and I personally wouldn't consider that to be outside of the pale. Right?
So again, it depends what you mean. So I would consider it outside the pale in certain circumstances. We have to be more precise about what we're talking about. I asked a Shaila, I won't tell you of who because they didn't give me permission, when I went to hear shofar in a Chabad Messianic shul in Israel, and I wanted to know whether I was Yotze, whether I fulfilled my obligation, because I wasn't sure. And the person who I asked said, yes, you are. So I went with that. But I think it was a legitimate question to ask. In other words, there is a line someplace, and that's...
But what I think is that line was created for people who their goal is to take down the movement from within. In other words, and that's what I heard from you, which is what I'm saying is, as long as no one's going to say of the Chabad Messianic, the Meshachist Chabad, their goal is to take down Judaism. They're not. They're there actually to spread Judaism.
But I'm not sure that's the standard. I think the standard is also how effective are they going to be, because they may take it down without wanting to, without intending to.
But Judaism has always evolved, right? In other words, that's fine.
You keep coming back to slogans. Don't tell me Judaism always involved. Oh, it's all practice. These are 19th century slogans that we have outgrown, okay? And that I think Rav Kook wants us to outgrow as well. Of course, you say Judaism is always involved. Yes, but that doesn't mean that it's not something, right? In other words, it doesn't mean that it's infinitely malleable.
So but you brought up the Balei Tosfos. You confined within the Balei Tosfos, right? This idea of God being a body. And as long as someone can point to, there is an ancient text.
But let's be precise. They didn't say God is a body. They said, or this author said,
or has a body.
No, they didn't even say that. They said, who are you to say that God can't have a body? Do you hear the difference between those statements?
Yeah, it's only because in the Torah itself, it seems to indicate, if from a literal reading, that God does have a body. So in other words, but that's the point. And it's really interesting because I think I mentioned this before, but there's my background as being a Chabadnik originally. I in fairness to Chabad, I consider myself to be post-Chabad today, but I learned a lot of the Rebbe, and forgive me if I don't paraphrase this correctly, but he says, and I don't remember exactly where because it's been a while, that no one ever explained to him logically why God can't come in the physical form. And he explains basically why that is a difficult logical thing to say. And then he concludes that the only reason why we shouldn't say that he comes in the physical form is only one reason, because Maimonides says he doesn't. That's it. In other words,
so look, you know that this is fraught within Hasidism. Okay, so this is, I'm not sure what level of Hebrew the people listening to this might have, so I'm trying to translate everything, right? Yeah. But this is a machloket, Rambam v'Ravad. This is an argument between Maimonides and his contemporary, Rabbi Avram ben David, who was in Paskier. And when Maimonides says in the very first chapter of the Mishnah Torah, okay, now again, I'm not talking about the Guide of the Perplexed, I'm talking about his halachic work. The very first chapter, he says that anybody who believes that God has a body is a heretic and is outside of the Jewish community. So there on the page, in all the printed editions, there's a comment of the Rava who takes him to task.
Yeah.
but he takes him to task in a particular way. He doesn't say, what do you mean? Of course God has a body. We've always said that. He doesn't say that. He seems to indicate that he agrees with Maimonides in the sense, of course, we don't believe that God has a, but he says, how can you call somebody a heretic who is simply, they're reading the Midrashim or they're reading the verses and they're led astray by it? That's not a heretic.
Yeah.
Okay, so he's lomed zchut, he's defending the Jewish people, but he's not actually saying, Rambam, you're wrong about this. Okay, now, fast forward 800 years. So another Hasidic author, and I just want to make clear, this is not all about Chabad, right? But another Hasidic author that I have spent a lot of time with, Rabbi Kalanimus Shapira, the author of a work that's called Kodesh,
Ish Kodesh,
who perished, unfortunately, in the Warsaw Ghetto. But before the war, he wrote a little spiritual handbook for close students. In fact, I heard once that he only published like 6 or 10 copies, and they only went to select the people. One turned up in the 770 library from the Theological Rebbe, Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak. How he got it, I don't know, but it's in the library. And the family wasn't sure about having this book released, but it was reprinted anyway 20 years ago. Now you can buy it for 10 shekels anyplace. It's called B'nai Machshava Tova, right? It's about meditation. And he says something that also has echoes in Rav Kook. And by the way, he and Rav Kook were aware of one another. But he says the following: whatever you think is theologically the clearest way of saying things, nevertheless, when you're praying, it's different than when you're learning or philosophizing. Mm-hmm. And it's very difficult to pray with fervor unless you are willing to relax the stricture, right? You have to envision that there's somebody there you're talking to. So he says, for that purpose, the Ra'avad is sufficient for us to rely upon. Mm-hmm. Right? In other words, that's a case where he explicitly says, no, Maimonides, you put you aside for this matter. Now, Rav Kook doesn't say it quite so boldly, but he also said that being afraid to use physical imagery in prayer is a source of great spiritual degradation. Mm-hmm. But he thinks that prayer is also a very different situation than the situation of, for instance, study. Mm-hmm. In other words, in study, first of all, it's freewheeling. You have to be willing to ask any question. But then when it comes time to pray, you put your blinders on and you're focused on piety. It's a very different thing. Okay, we're digressing from the digression, but I'll point at a prayer leader. And they stand up and they say, oh, dear God, your mercies extend to the nests of birds. You have to tell them to be quiet and step down and replace them with somebody else. What's going on? So there's a commandment in the Torah that says when you want to harvest eggs or baby birds of a wild bird, we're not talking about chickens, you have to shoo the mother bird away. And there are all sorts of debates about why that is. Okay, Maimonides' reason for that commandment is that birds have feelings too. Yeah. And they feel pain when they see their babies being taken. And so the Torah tells you, get rid of them, okay? Yeah. But in that case, why should we not want someone to say that when they stand up in prayer? Mm-hmm. The Mishnah says, because they're turning God's gezerot, God's decrees, into rachamim, right? In other words, they're not relating to God through the lens of justice or even straight divine will, but only through the lens of compassion, right? Now, in learning, you're allowed to think about maybe God is trying to have compassion on the bird, right? But Rav Kook says you're not allowed to do that exact same thing in prayer, because in prayer we're not speculating. Okay, in prayer we're focused on the divine will as we know it, and we're going to send away the mother bird because the Torah tells us to. And, there may well be another rationale for that, as the Ramban says, maybe we're trying to preserve the species, right? But you also wouldn't stand up in prayer and say, oh God, just like you preserve the species by sending away the mother bird, so let us preserve the species. You could imagine certain Jewish communities wanting to do that. But I think that also may have been considered heretical if the rabbis had an inkling of that. So it's not even as simple as to say we believe this or don't believe that, but how does this belief function in this setting, and how does it function in that setting? Now, you talk about people trying to destroy from the inside. So there are people like that. For instance, there are people we know who have converted even to Orthodox Judaism with very fine, upstanding conversions, who had later turned out were closet missionaries. And these are true stories. They're not as common as some people think, but there are definitely bona fide stories where that was the case. And they converted under false pretenses in order to proselytize Jews, okay? There are also people who may share their beliefs, but were born Jewish and don't think that they're doing anything dishonest, right? They think they're just sharing their message with their brethren. And nevertheless, I would exclude them from a synagogue. Somebody else might not. But I think when you live in a Christian-dominated society and you're hemmed in on all sides and people are trying to convert you left and right, so tolerating that could be very destructive. If I lived in Israel, who knows? Maybe I'd feel differently. I don't know. They have other concerns than we do. Rav Herzog, the chief rabbi of Israel, was in the 1950s, right? The first chief rabbi of the independent state of Israel, was asked a question about many traditional synagogues have these ornaments on the ark where the Torah is kept, like lions or unicorns, different things. Sometimes they're just images, but sometimes they're little metal figurines that are, or wooden, whatever, that are attached to the top of the aron. And some purist came to me and said, isn't that usher? Why are we doing that? That's a graven image. Rav Herzog said something very interesting. He said, of course, it's not a graven image. How do we know that? Because generations of very pious Jews in Europe had those on in their synagogues. And we know that they weren't praying to them and that they had no religious significance at all. And it was just purely decorative. Okay. And we have no doubt about that. He said, this is not like maybe some of them were worshiping it. We don't think so. Okay. However, he says, we live in a majority Muslim part of the world. And the Muslims will think that we're worshiping idols because they have also very strict anti-iconic traditions. And so he thought that in Eretz Yisrael, people should not put those on their Aron Kodesh, even though he never would conceive that his great-grandfather in Germany or whatever, was worshiping the unicorn. But you have to be cognizant of the situation in which you live and what's going on. In the 1860s, 70s, 80s, rabbis in Germany had some very lenient positions on conversion because they still thought it was going to be possible to stop the tide of reform. And they wanted to convert as many people as possible to prevent them from going and strengthening the nascent reform movement. We now know that didn't work and it's not going to work. So that doesn't necessarily mean that those opinions are now wrong and rejected and whatever. It's a complicated question. But I think you certainly have to take into account that some of their reasons for leniency, just like maybe some of their reasons for being strict, no longer apply. And when that changes, then you have to ask yourself the questions. Okay, so what has changed here? There are things would you hold a secular concert of classical music? Okay, now forget about vocals. Would you play classical music in a synagogue for people to come on a Saturday night and hear a concert? The Melamed Lahoil, whose name I'm just blanking on at this very moment, has a tshuva about this, in which he's ambivalent, but he comes down negatively. And part of the reason he comes down negatively is because he says it's a desecration of the synagogue. People don't use synagogues that way, right? But let's say if you live in a reality like some synagogues in America, where after prayer they take the chairs away and they put down tables for kiddush, right? That prayer space doesn't have the same kind of sanctity because you're not allowed to eat in a synagogue. Okay. People don't know that, right? But you can designate a room and say,
shouldn't really kiss your child in the synagogue either.
Sorry?
You shouldn't really kiss your child in the synagogue either.
So fine. I'm not going to talk about that, but sure.
No, but the point is that as there are very few synagogues today which take on that particular.
Sure. So
because most of them are multi-purpose rooms, right?
Where you are in history matters, but each of these things, it's not just Judaism evolves. Do we want? But there's halakhic consideration that goes into.
Yeah, it's case by. What you're saying is it's still the nuances. The nuances is and the case by case. But when you go down to the cellular level, if you like, each one has its own purpose, etc. When you then zoom out again, and you look at it in general, each one of those little changes which happen as a result of the differing circumstances
I'll give you an example.
Cause it over time to evolve and change, and it does evolve and change. And
I'll give you an example. Sorry, go ahead.
No, so all I'm saying is that I understand it's a catchphrase. Judaism evolves, and your response to that is, well, it doesn't evolve; it changes in very specific and intentional way based on circumstances which are well thought out and have a lot of halachic basis, etc.
And sometimes it just changes randomly. But saying it evolves has connotations for me of an old style of liberal Jewish argument, which
I didn't mean.
I don't think you did, but I want to be clear because I live in that world intellectually. I study those texts. I hear Abraham Geiger saying things change, so why doesn't everything change?
Let's do whole scale change of everything. Yes.
So here's an example of something that has changed. I'm not sure it's an evolution, but it's a change in which I don't follow the practice of Rav Kook, which is that Rav Kook, when he was asked, thought that in modern Israel, people should be very careful to hold on to the pronunciation and manner of speech of their own Jewish community wherever they came from. So Temanim should speak like Temanim, and Ashkenazim should speak like Ashkenazim.
Speak or pray?
Both. I don't know if he was talking about speaking in the marketplace. I don't, but certainly for prayer and reading Torah.
Yeah.
But which means that maybe like you have to make some effort to go to the synagogue with the Jews from Jerba and not the synagogue with the Jews from Tzana, right? Or the Jews from Poland rather than Jews from Lithuania, right? Because they each had different pronunciation.
Yeah.
So I think history, there are some people who still are quite careful about that. But I think in general, history simply poskined against him in the sense that I don't think he could have envisioned the level of movement and displacement of Jews that took place in the 100 years since he died. How many Ashkenazim and Sephardim have intermarried in Israel? It's a huge number. And nobody is still living in the same places their great-grandparents were living. Nobody. There are like 10 people in Rome who have been there, whose families have been there for 2,000 years. But every other Jewish community has been uprooted.
Yeah.
And if not the whole community, then most of the individuals.
He lived prior to the Holocaust. So.
He died in 1935. So there was a lot of displacement from World War I, but it wasn't like what came later. We have a community which is fascinating. It's a traditionalist community in which everybody's first language has changed at least once in the last 100 years, right? So if my great-grandparents came back, my great-grandparents came to America, so I could speak English with them. But if their parents came back, I don't know that I would be able to talk to them. And it's not just silly Baal Tshuva, but I think it's widely true. No, I don't speak Yiddish, but if there's such a thing. But they've only now formulated grammar rules for Yiddish, which I think is funny, right? But
so let's wrap this up because I find this has been fascinating and really interesting.
I thought this was just the introduction. We didn't really say anything yet.
we didn't get into the core of it, which is Rav Kook's approach to which we were going to talk about, and perhaps there should be a part 2 in the offing. But Rav Kook's approach to one's spiritual worship and one's spiritual approach to Judaism, which
spiritual path,
which could be multifaceted or pluralistic.
So again, pluralism is one of those terms, right? I think he would say it could be Orthodox pluralistic, but not pluralistic in the sense of let's invite the Buddhists also. That's a different thing. I have tremendous respect for Buddhists, but I don't think that their prayers belong in a synagogue. That's a can of worms. But let's take it a step back from Rav Kook. Let's go back to Europe. So as in the beginnings of the Hasidic movement, people joined different courts. Everybody joined the court of a different master, a different tzaddik. And the different courts had sometimes quite different modes of spiritual life. One was more studious, one was about shouting out loud in prayer, one was about the quest for truth unceasingly. People had different, I don't mean this in a non-honorable way, but everybody had their own shtick.
Yeah.
And you gravitated to wherever you gravitated. So already in the aftermath of World War I, we find that so many Jews had moved to the cities because the countryside had been devastated, the economics fell apart, and Jews became urban. In Poland, I'm talking about in Poland. And we see that already in between the wars before the Holocaust, there was an emergence of what one historian has called a la carte Hasidism, which means that people would go to this Rebbe for this purpose, they would go to that Rebbe for that purpose, and they didn't always feel tremendous loyalty to just one school. Okay, now that's a sociological observation.
Today they call them international Hasidim.
Good, okay, I haven't heard that word. I like a la carte, but fine. But the same writer that I mentioned to you before, Rabbi Kalanimus Shapira, in one of his pre-war drashot, his pre-war essays, says that everybody has to find a spiritual path, but they don't necessarily have to have just one. So if you think about he calls it the derech ha'avodah, if you think about the manner of service of Rabbi Elimelech of Lezhensk in prayer, and that really motivates you. So think about that. And then when it comes to study, you find that really you're drawn to somebody else. So you don't have to have just one model. It's okay to have more than one model. The question becomes how to have an integrated life and not to just fly off in a million different directions and accomplish nothing. That's a real question. Mm-hmm. And it may be that you need to have either mentors or a community or some grounding feature to make sure, because you can't do everything all at once. But just to take this full circle from where we started, I live comfortably in a modern Orthodox community. A lot of my spiritual life takes place in Hasidism and in medieval Jewish thought, not only the Rambam, but in particular the Rambam. And temperamentally, in many ways, I'm a Misnagid, and I very much appreciate Reb Chaim of Volozhin and the Gra and that side of things. And when I'm deep in learning a particular book, I tend to identify with the author and with the path that book is teaching very strongly. And some people think that that's not something you should do because it waters down everything, right? You don't have one path. But that's part of what draws me to Rav Kook, because Rav Kook says in a quote that we started with, he said, we've grown beyond this. It may be that at the time he was alive, I'm now saying more than Rav Kook said, but it may be that in the time that he was alive, it was possible to say about Maimonides, he was a heretic, or to say about the Ravad, oh, he was a heretic. There are people who have survived 800, 900 years of scrutiny and are still revered by the Orthodox community broadly. And when you've crossed that barrier, it becomes silly to turn around and say, oh, he was a heretic. I won't learn anything from Maimonides. That's just a kind of stubbornness. And at a certain point, you have to figure out how to integrate both Maimonides and the Ravad and the Rashbam and the Balei Tosfot and the Mekubalim and the Ari and the Ramah. And Rav Kook was very much inclined towards, first of all, you had to acknowledge that these sources were saying different things. You can't pretend that they all have the same thing to say. That's a different affliction of the contemporary Orthodox world. But once you acknowledge in a kind of scholarly, scholastic way that, yes, they had very different opinions, and even the Ari and Rabbi Moshe Cordovero, who lived at the same time in the same place and were both Kabbalists, also had very different opinions about all sorts of important matters. But nevertheless, we who come 500 years later don't always have to take sides. Right? Say, oh, Ramah, I follow the Ramah. There may be people who do that, and they may even be people who have a family tradition like that in some way or another. But for most of us who are just exposed to the breadth and the depth of the Jewish library, which I see sitting behind you. So
some of it is.
Some of it is. But why would somebody feel it's necessary to decide that they want to exclude? You can't exclude the Rambam. You can't be literate today without knowing the Rambam well. And you can't learn Gemara today without knowing the Balei Tosafot. Like you can't. It doesn't make sense. It's impoverishing. So he says there has to be a way of moving beyond those kinds of narrow sympathies without just throwing the whole thing open and say, it's Torah also. I don't think he was going that far, although he read Nietzsche, and Nietzsche had an influence on him. But I don't think that he said Birkat Torah when he read Nietzsche. And there is still room for those kinds of distinctions to be made. There are things that are valuable that are not Torah. Okay, so now I've outed myself. That's a very modern Orthodox thing to say, right? There are things that are valuable that are not Torah. But having said that, the distinction is still important to me. In other words, I want people to read broadly. I gave a class recently, we talked about Spinoza, right? I have no problem with people reading broadly in literature, right? But you still have to know when you say Birkat Torah and when you don't say Birkat Torah. And I think that's an enormously important question. And I would say Birkat Torah for halacha, for agadah, for midrash, for psukim, for almost any kind of learning that is somehow within the canon. And for reading Rav Kook and for reading the Lubavitcher Rebbe and reading Rabbi Nachman and et cetera, and for reading Rabbi Hirsch. Are there figures that are on the boundary for me? Sure. So it's like Shechianu, learn somebody else first and then you can learn them. And then you don't have to decide. You don't have to decide whether or not to say a bracha. Don't bring the book in the bathroom if you're not sure. But I believe that we live in a moment where, particularly in North America, Our problem is not that we are overly committed to a particular theological position. It's that we don't articulate any theological position, right? So forget about Chabad, which has its own thing going on. Chabad has a very strong theological tradition, but not everybody, most of the people who pray in Chabad houses have never heard about it, because that's not where they live, right? And that's not the fault of Chabad rabbis. They are doing a particular kind of outreach, and that's completely wonderful. But the community that I live my bread and butter in and raise my children in, which is the modern Orthodox community, I don't think has quite such a well-developed theology. And I think it's a problem, because you can send kids to school and teach them to learn Gemara and teach them to obey halacha. But one day they greet a big wide world. They may go to college and they may read about evolution, or they may read about something else. And all of a sudden the scales fall from their eyes and say, why didn't anybody tell me about this? It's a big world and I don't want to live in a bubble. If I could wave my magic wand and change the Jewish conversation today in my little corner of it, I can't even do that, right? Who listens to me? But I would say that school curriculums, for example, probably could sacrifice a little bit of the time they spend teaching Talmud, which most of the kids will never come back to, and spend a little bit more time teaching people the depth and the breadth and the beauty of Jewish thought, of the Maharal and the Rambam and the Ramban and Ibn Ezra, right? So that when they confront life's problems going on, not all of which are halachic problems, and not all of which are soluble by saying, go ask the rabbi, they will understand that, gee, this problem, like biblical criticism, sure, it's a real serious issue. But even Ezra confronted some of this 800, 900 years ago. So this is not new to us. And Rav Kook dealt very extensively with evolution. So this is not new to us. And our answers in this generation, B'zman hazeh, may turn out to be different than Rav Kook's work. I'm not about crystallizing Judaism around somebody who lived 100 years ago either, right? But he gives us a path, a roadmap, a path through the desert. An approach. And part of that approach is learn everything, learn everybody as deeply as you can. And then you begin to build a synthesis. Not everybody can do this, but some people.
I find that at least I've read a little bit of, and it's been a while, of Rav Kook, from Rav Kook himself. But reading your article recently, which you kindly sent me, has reintroduced me to him. But it sounds like you got a very Hegelian approach, or at least the way you present.
I think Hegel had a very Rav Kookian approach. Don't always assume that the influence had to come into the Jewish community. Sometimes the influence goes out from the Jewish community. And there are people who write about that kind of thing. But yeah, some people have said Rav Kook is Hegelian. I don't know enough Hegel to make that an intelligent statement. I try to keep away from things I don't know enough about to comment on intelligently. But he was definitely a Ramchalian. And the Ramchal, Rabbi Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, who lived in the 1700s, I think, had a very advanced sense of history and change and dialectic and the movement towards perfection, which we might call progress or evolution. Yeah. And Rav Kook swallowed that whole. Of course, he wasn't limited by it, though, because alongside the Ramchal, he had the Ari, and he had the Ramak, and he had the Rambam. This is just something so fascinating. In the letters of, forget it is published right, in the letters of Rav Kook, he has a letter to somebody defending the authenticity of the Zohar, because there's a split in the Yemenite community in particular between the Maimonidean Yemenites and the Kabbalistic Yemenites, and there's no middle ground. So there was a particular
This is your other area of expertise.
Sorry?
Your other area of expertise.
So there was somebody who published an article attacking the Zohar, and Rav Kook wrote a very strong response defending the Zohar. And then somebody from the other side wrote a strong letter attacking Maimonides. And Rav Kook wrote a very strong letter defending Maimonides. And he didn't see this as a contradiction, and he didn't see it as, he also didn't think the Rambam and the Zohar were saying the same thing. Because if you look at them honestly, there's lots of intersection and overlap, but they're not, you don't walk away with the same message from the two of them. And that's important to recognize. But it's the upheaval, everyone's talking about climate change. Let's give a climate change metaphor. So I read something alarmist in the newspaper, I hope it's not true, that the Gulf Stream is about to stop moving, right? If it happens, people will play this again to show how stupid people were 5 years ago, that they didn't think it was really going to happen. But that would be devastating. One of the reasons it's devastating, not just to climate, but to food, to everything, is because when cold water currents hit warm water currents, someplace in the ocean, those are always places where there's a lot of life, because there are a lot of creatures that need the warm water, but the energy and the oxygen and the nutrients come from the cold water upwelling from the bottom. And where those meet, there's life. I think Rav Kook would 100% say that's how it is in Torah. It's where the streams meet that life has a chance of taking place and taking hold. And the attempt to keep each stream in its own narrow space and not allow them to overflow or talk to each other is the antithesis of that. And I'll give you some red meat to end with, right? So just in one statement that was censored from the first edition of Orot HaTshuva, here comes Elul, but it's republished in the newer Orot HaTshuva. Kook said, and if this seems outlandish to me, you just have to invite me back to talk about it again. He said, the attempt to create a world without sin would be the worst kind of sin. Okay, that's not saying that people should feel licensed to go and sin. On the contrary, he was very firm, he was very pious. But it's saying that sin is inevitable. It's going to happen. And when it happens, we have to recognize that very often it comes from an upwelling of life. It comes from the water overflowing the bounds. It's not something that is intrinsically evil. It's just something that there's a power there that needs to be harnessed. But human beings, being what we are, we never harness things completely the right way. And maybe we can't. So sometimes we go a little too far this way and we go a little too far that way. But the goal is not to stifle it so that we never do anything wrong. That's craziness. The goal is to do everything we can right and to recognize that when things go wrong, there's a process called tshuva, which allows us to take that energy and bring it back into the system.
That's a synthesis. Yeah.
Sure.
But I really appreciate you explaining this. I saw that also in your article, at least, where the conversation about bringing questions in and having challenges, and that is a positive thing because that takes you to the next level instead of being afraid of them. And that's similar to what you've just said about sinning, that through the sin in some way, you get to the higher level in a place where, where Bali Tshuva, where penitents can stand, even complete righteous people cannot stand. That's that concept of taking that. I think similar to what you're saying. One comment just to wrap this up is that what you've really described in this, I think it's been close to an hour and a half of conversation, is a lot of nuance, which...
That's one way of saying it.
No, but to be able to, on the one hand, people, and I think that, and then I love that because I think the people, we don't have the biggest audience in this podcast, but the people who do listen to it are people who really appreciate nuance, which is why I want, one of the reasons I knew I'd get nuance and why I wanted to have you as a guest. But people do seek black and whites. And one of the reasons why I don't feel as optimistic that this kind of approach, which I love, it will gain a wider audience is because people don't do nuance that well. But the nuance, for those who really need the nuance, they can't live without it. And therefore that has to, in a sense, that has to be available to people, that nuance, and you're providing it. And for the people who need black and white, is it good? Is it bad? Can I eat that? Can I not? Etc. Those people, that exists in abundance for those people. And you're saying we need a lot more nuance. There's not just the Rambam. There's not just Chassidut. There's these other things as well. And open yourself up to it. Learn it.
Anything that people care about is nuanced. In other words, there are people who care about wine, and they can tell you about the small differences in the aroma between this wine and that wine, or single malt Scotch, or cars, or fashion. Whatever people really care about, they invest with nuance and patience and energy. And if we want the Jewish tradition to shine, then we have to be less concerned about which bottle of Scotch somebody brought to the Kiddush Club, and a little bit more concerned about which sefer they're carrying and how we can have a conversation about it. That's all.
Yeah, I love that. And actually, I think it's such an important point because the people who don't care about nuance, the people who don't appreciate the nuance, perhaps it's because they don't have that deep engagement and the true love for it. It's the people who are deeply engaged, as you mentioned. I love the wine example. because I buy all different kinds of wine. People come to my house and they, oh, this is so great. I have no idea how good it is. But the other people love it.
Doesn't your brother own a liquor store or something like that, if I remember? No, okay.
No. But my nephews were selling liquor online, but that's in England. But the point is that the point I try and make is, I think, but the people who do really understand it have a deep appreciation for it. And I think that's such a good example for the people of the book, although I don't like referring to ourselves as such because that's an outside reference. But we really are people who love this book.
Yeah.
And these series
we're people of books.
Of books, yeah.
Books.
And that we should be able to appreciate the different nuances which are inherent in all of them. And you've given us some appreciation of that today. I'm really grateful.
Thank you for the opportunity. I hope you have a wonderful new year and all good things.
Thank you. Thank you so much.